today we're talking about returns, Walmart Returns 101. We want to kind of cover some of the basics with that and maybe dive into a few specifics as well. This isn't exactly a deduction, but as with all retail supplier relationships, miscommunications and deductions can abound. So hopefully we'll have some helpful information for you guys here today on this subject. And here we are. We coordinate a lot of content here on the Supplier Wiki team. We are the Supplier Wiki subset of SupplyPike. So we are here to create free educational content for you guys. Let us know what you want to hear. What do you want us to research for you? As I like to say, let us be the educational branch of your business so that you don't have to spend a lot of time going out there trying to research stuff.
Thank you, Peter, for that awesome introduction. And we're going to get into today's content. So as Peter kind of framed up, we talk a lot about revenue loss here at SupplyPike and how we can help prevent that revenue loss for CPG suppliers or even help dispute. And today we're going to focus on the Walmart's returns process, how you can prevent those and how you can dispute them. So just to frame up today's conversation, if you've been on webinars before, you've seen we talk about deduction shortages, overages, different deductions you can receive through allowances. And now we're focusing on return fines. So wanted to start today's conversation looking at the way that return fines can stack, because it's pretty table stakes to how we look at the conversation. So if you're receiving a return fine, you're going to get a fine for the return saying, hey, this inventory we're sending it back, we're returning it for some reason. And those are going to be broken out into codes 91, 92, 93, 94, or 95. But you're usually going to see a grouping put together with those 91 through 95 charges. So that's the actual fine for return. But then you're also going to see a handling fee for returning that, depending on how your online supplier agreement builds out the return process. And then you're going to see a freight charge and that's a code 44 for returning that product back to you, or whatever the process is. Walmart is going to ensure that you will be paying for the extra work it takes to, instead of putting the inventory out on the floor and customers being able to purchase it being sent back to you or sent to a consolidation center, or if it's a damaged good, being completely destroyed. So that's how single return codes can start to stack on each other within a PO. But this doesn't even include other deductions or fines that can be impacted in this situation. So you can get a return code, but there are other impacts from returns on compliance programs. So we've used this graphic a lot, but we would classify the returns into a deduction. So that's going to be in the form of a deduction fine that you would dispute either through APDP or you would dispute through the returns center. And we'll kind of get into that later. But I wanted to call out the other issues that returns can create. When we start unpacking the reason why suppliers receive returns, you'll see that you can also make a connection to OTIF fines, which is Walmart's on time and in full program. And you can receive SQEP fines on top of these types of deductions. So what's a good example of that happening? Let's say that for some reason, there's some type of overage within the return. You've sent, you have a shortage because of a return, but then you end up getting an overage, or you're missing the timing issue with the way that the POs are lining up as you're replacing a damaged one with a new return. You might end up receiving an OTIF fine or a SQEP fine if the packaging is damaged, if the pallet load is damaged. There's lots of different avenues to receive fines, and one issue can really start to create this avalanche of other compliance programs fining you. One thing I want to call out here as well is each compliant program will penalize you, not because they are malicious and they want to take as much money from your your pocket as possible. It's really because these compliance programs don't talk to each other and have separate processes for disputing and charging fines. So it's really on the burden of the supplier to make sure that these compliance programs are being disputed and that you're not being charged or triple charged for different fines that come in the form of deductions, SQUEP fines, or OTIF fines. All right. So now that we've kind of framed up the impact of returns and how they can create other issues in your supply chain, let's talk about how we get started addressing our Walmart returns. The first and foremost thing, and I'm going to say it, you can have a count if you want, because I know I'm going to say it a lot in today's conversation. Know your OSA. So what is your OSA? That's your online supplier agreement, and it's your agreement with Walmart outlining all of the information that you agree to adhere to when working with Walmart. So your returns process, your allowances, your shipping and payment terms are all going to be in your OSA. And actually, I'll walk through kind of how you find your OSA, but I did see that there's a new-ish card you can put onto your retail link homepage that helps you look up your business terms, that you can actually just have that card in, and you can look up your allowance, all the really quick things you want to know about your OSAs, depending on your different vendor agreements. If you have different brands underneath, one total vendor, that's a really helpful tip. And I'll be sure to include kind of an outline and some pictures in another deck, but that's something I just saw the other day. So review your OSA, know your information. The second thing, if you're getting started looking at your Walmart returns, review the reason codes and learn what to avoid with returns. There are roughly 75 AP deduction codes at Walmart, and we actually have a resource that I'm sure Peter can link in the chat below of the different fines you can receive, what the codes actually mean, like what is a code 22? What does that stand for? Why might I be getting this code? How to prevent it? And how do I know if this is disputable or not? So go ahead and review the reason codes, especially for returns in that document, but we're also going to send out this slide deck and we're going to go over some of the high level details on the return reason codes. So stay tuned for that. Third thing is check your current return disputes for validity. When disputing, the first thing you need to do is if you see a fine, you see a return fine coming into your APDP app, you should check to see if it's valid or not. That's the first step with disputing any type of deduction, is seeing if it is invalid, meaning the supplier should not be charged for this particular deduction, or if it is valid, and understanding how to address the root cause of that particular fine. From there, take those invalid turns. You've addressed the valid returns, and you're building a process for addressing those issues in your supply chain. But go ahead and take those invalid returns and dispute those. You'll have to gather some proof documentation, talk to different teams, and depending on where and how these returns are coming to you, you'll have to dispute them in some different ways, which we'll get into later in today's presentation. And then the last thing, I've kind of spoken to this, is whether it's valid or invalid, knowing what process created that fine in your system. So if it's invalid, knowing how to correct that and saving that documentation and that process for your team. But if it's valid, saying that the supplier is at fault, start to learn how you and your teams and your cross-functional teams can build out a process that helps you avoid those valid return deductions. So where can you find your supplier agreement? We kind of talked about this at the very beginning, and it's important to call this out pretty regularly because I feel like every so often the OSA sort of moves through Retail Link and you have to relearn how you find it. But essentially, OSAs are no longer through apps. You actually find them on the homepage. So it's a little bit easier to navigate. So to access your online supplier agreement, you'll go to the top of Retail Link. You'll click the icon of the little person and you'll scroll down to My Agreements. Then you'll be presented with two options, depending on how many business units you are in for Walmart. So it'll either be Sam's Club, Walmart.com. You'll click on the particular business unit you want to navigate into, and then you can find the PDF that you're looking for that covers that OSA. And a quick call out, make sure you're looking at the most recent version. I know some suppliers have that I've spoken to have had issues of looking at a dated one. So usually there's a button that will help you navigate to find the latest version. So just go ahead and make sure you're doing that because things change. All right, now we're going to get into covering the different codes for returns and what those actually mean. So the first code is a code 44, which is freight on returned merchandise and returned goods. So that's kind of going back to that first example when we were talking about the fees that kind of stack on top of your actual reason code for claims. The code 44 is saying, hey, we're charging you for the cost of freight to return this merchandise to you or to a consolidation center or whatever your OSA outlines that your returned goods should go to. The next code is a code 91. This is for merchandise destroyed, damaged, or defective. And we'll kind of get into what that means, but it's pretty basic here. It obviously just means that that merchandise is you're unable to sell it, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to keep it either on Walmart's side or on your side. The third code we have here is code 92. So this is a merchandise return. And this one is different than a code 93 because it is specifically for an overstock or recall. We'll get into that later here in a second. The fourth code is code 93, which is another merchandise code, but then that subtext there is damaged merchandise. And you can kind of start to see that these start to overlap with code 91 and code 93, really looking very similar, but we'll kind of break down those details. And this is really helpful to just pause here and look at these in particular. And again, we'll send this deck, so don't worry about feeling like you have to write all these down really quick. It's helpful to pause here to see how much overlap there is, and that really the reason codes do break down a significant amount of detail. You just have to know what detail that Walmart's talking about. So with damaged merchandise, we'll talk a little bit about why that one is different than code 91. Then code 94 is goods returned / defective merchandise. So again, these kind of start to muddle together, but again, we're going to break them out. The last one here in the 91 to 95 section, which is really going to be the bread and butter of what the code actually means, is merchandise returned for a wrong item. And then back to code 97, it's similar to code 44, and you might see it as another number like code 60. Those are pretty similar. It's a handling charge essentially for returning the goods. It's the labor involved. That it's the cost of labor involved for handling those returned goods and getting them to the place they need to be. And then lastly is code 120. And this is a Walmart claim that is broken out for the return center. So we'll kind of unpack what that means as well. But this is just a quick overview. All right. So let's start with the code 44. We talked a little bit about this, but essentially it refers to the freight charged to ship the merchandise back to the supplier, or if you're shipping to whatever your OSA outlines, it could be a consolidation center, et cetera. So it's going to be for that freight charges. And they're always going to come across on a claim that also includes a return deduction, kind of like I listed out before. So with code 44 is a really helpful tip to just outline. If you're seeing one of these in APDP, make sure that you're finding I like to call it the like meat and potatoes return code. That's going to be the main course. That's really what this code 44 is attached to. And when we get to the disputing section, it's a lot easier to dispute a code 44 when you can dispute a bread and butter return code together. It just makes sense to pair those together. So that's just one call out there. All right, code 91. So what is a code 91? This stands for destroyed, damaged, and defective. And code 91s are for that merchandise that cannot be returned, therefore it was destroyed. So this will be outlined in your supplier agreement. So this is really important to check. But if the merchandise is unreturnable, it would be negotiated that Walmart just handles destroying that, throwing it away. And that will really depend on the category you're in. For an example, a produce supplier is not going to want smushed bananas. Whereas maybe depending on the way that your category works, maybe with like electronics, headphones, maybe it's defective and destroyed, but you still want that back because of accounting purposes or something like that. So really, for these, it's best to know exactly what your OSA says when you get a destroyed, damaged, or completely defective inventory, where that goes. All right. So what is a code 92? These are going to be sent when merchandise is returned due to an overstock or recall. Overstock, this is pretty table stakes for all suppliers, but we'll go over kind of the definitions. Walmart couldn't sell a product, therefore it's being returned to the supplier. Something we saw during COVID, or not even COVID, kind of the TikTok phase with fidget spinners. Those were really hot for a long time. And then Walmart just had it felt like a whole 8-foot shelf of fidget spinners. I felt like they couldn't get rid of them for the longest time. So that maybe would be an overstock item. And then recall is when suppliers, consumers, the different regulations that are placed on your type of category, or manufacturers discover safety issues or defects, or even a possible problem that pose risk to consumers. The one that's made recent headlines is the listeria in deli meats. So if you're making any charcuterie boards right now, go ahead and check that out, because there has been a major recall. And those specific suppliers are probably seeing some code 92s coming their way. The next one is a code 93, and this is damaged merchandise. So remember, we talked about damaged, defective. That's when that's a code 91, and that's when merchandise is unreturnable. This is for merchandise returned due to damages that prevented the item from being sold. So there's a little bit of a difference here. The first difference being it's not a pile of broken, defective merchandise, but the second piece of that is that this claim is applied before the merchandise is placed on the store floor. So a good example of this is maybe a concealed shortage, and then you receive a code 93. So let's say you've shipped a pallet of merchandise. You got it to the store. It went through the DC. It was, warehouse picked and then pulled out, and you sent, your one case pack, and they opened the case pack, and all of the one of the glass bowls is chipped on the side. The rest of the glass bowls could go out onto the store floor, but that particular item, that one glass bowl that's chipped, the claim would be applied because it was put on before the merchandise hit the store floor. So just to recap, it's damaged, but could be returned to the supplier, and it hits before the merchandise is placed on the store floor. And this is another one that we see a lot of, concealed shortages or additional deductions placed on code 93s. All right, code 94. So this is for goods returned and defective merchandise. So what is a code 94? This refers to a customer return that is considered defective merchandise. So different than code 93 is that the claim is applied after the merchandise is placed on the store floor and a customer has purchased the item. So this kind of goes back to your category. Let's say I wanted to return an item from clothing that wasn't damaged. Depending on your OSA, I could outline that would just go back to the store floor. Or let's say I have an item that, let's say body wash. That's something that they wouldn't want to place back on the store floor. I considered it defective. It didn't work for me. So I brought it back to Walmart to return with my receipt, and then they're not able to place this back on the store floor. But I would say looking into both your category type and knowing the type of returns and kind of what's the standard there, and also looking into Walmart's return policy. I haven't reviewed that in a while, but I think it's pretty standard that as long as you have your receipt, you can return items to Walmart. So that's how Code 94 is a little bit different than Code 93, 92, and 91. All right, now we're almost to the tail end here of going through the return codes. Code 95 is a merchandise return for wrong item. So when the merchandise was returned to the supplier as the wrong item or an overage that the warehouse cannot keep. So I kind of spoke to how Code 94 can cause a lot of issues. This code, Code 95, actually has a lot of impact on several compliance programs. I'm sure if you have been looking at overages, you can see the connection across deductions, just an AP deduction. There's a separate code for an overage. There is Code 95 here for a merchandise return of wrong item. You can get an overage code in your SQUEB fines, and overage codes can also, you can make an argument on the OTIF side that because it's an overage, it can cause another shortage, and there can be issues with your on time and your on time and in full when it comes to the accuracy of your POs and when they're supposed to be coming in. So this is the one we see that suppliers get most tripped up with, is this wrong item. Okay, and then Code 97, we kind of talked about this earlier with Code 44. Code 97 is another kind of side dish to those main attraction return codes. This is the handling charge or manual labor required to return the merchandise, and it is not usually a standalone deduction. If you're seeing this as you're not able to track an invoice or claim number from a Code 97 or a Code 44 to one of those codes that are the meat and potatoes code, that Code 91 to Code 95, then I would either wait to see if it hits or start to ask questions and see if there is a main code, because this is not usually one that you would see coming across as a standalone deduction. All right. Then lastly is Code 120 claims. And this is issued from the return center, and they're very similar to Code 94's, but it's the return center's claim of Code 94's. This is helpful to piece out from Code 94's because you're going to have to dispute a different way. And it means that your supplier agreement is a little bit different. So you've elected not to have the defective merchandise returned, but have left it to handling to Walmart's discretion. So that's a really important thing to note, especially when it comes to disputing, because if this is not what you agreed to in your OSA, you can dispute this and get your money back. And then the last piece about Code 120s is that these will usually come through for bulk items. Instead of like one claim code, it will be a larger group of multiple defective items. All right. Now let's get into talking a little bit about preventing returns, and then we'll talk about how you can dispute those returns. And Peter, I'm just checking if there's any questions yet. I haven't seen too many come through yet.
We've got a few questions here that I think I'm going to save for the end, because although they're touching on things that are kind of specific to what you've mentioned, I think that they're kind of the answers are kind of more general. So we've got 3 here that I have yet to answer. We have one that I answered in the chat, which was about Code 97 versus Code 60. So one thing I would like to kind of just add in at this point that I've already kind of mentioned in the chat is how with Walmart, we know that fines stack. So some of these codes sound very similar to each other. And I think a part of that is that if they're similar enough, one kind of issue from a supplier's point of view can be hit with multiple fines. So I don't want to kind of accuse Walmart of doing something super malicious, but I do think that the sheer number of codes and the sheer number of codes that are used fairly often communicates that as well as the number of compliance teams and programs at place at Walmart communicates that these fines can stack. So sometimes one issue can get hit by multiple, and the same thing goes for invalid fines. So an apparent issue could be hit with multiple fines, and then all of those have to be kind of disputed separately as well. So again, that's just kind of boilerplate stuff that we always talk about, but something that is kind of, I think, relevant to this too.
No, that's helpful. And that actually goes straight into this next slide about knowing the specifics of your OSA, because as you'll start to see, the theme of the returns conversation and really the full deductions conversation is overlap in the way that things can overlap. So in your OSA, knowing where your customer returns are supposed to go, how they're supposed to be handled, if handling fees are something that are outlined clearly, or if they're more so if they're specifically not outlined. So if you're not supposed to have any handling fees because your prepaid supplier is picking that up for you or XYZ, the cost of defective returns. So knowing if you have an overage for any of those types of things and if it should be applied, understanding bulk return charges, if there's some sort of outline in your OSA that allows you to have bulk charges or a reduction on those because of an allowance for returns. What overstocks are, where overstocks are supposed to go and how they're supposed to be handled. What happens with wrong item returns, and really just taking this as, the 1,000-foot view of understanding that the OSA does help and is the pillar document when disputing returns, especially when things are invalid and not outlined to the letter of what the OSA outlines. A couple more important details to remember, and I kind of spoke to those, is know your current percentage of your defective allowance. If this is not a part of your OSA, maybe this is something that you start to have a conversation when it's time to make changes to your OSA, but that current percentage, either increasing that because of the category you're in or the situation of your supply chain or of just the industry. The latest supplier address is another huge issue that can help you prevent any problems. Just making sure that that is updated in your OSA and the correct contact information for the supplier address where returns should be sent. This is probably the number one reason for errors. So make sure no old addresses are listed or old contacts for that supplier address, whoever handles returns at your manufacturer, supplier warehouse, wherever you send returns. Just really calling that out. And you can change that in your OSA. If you don't have access to changing your supplier address or your supplier contact information, check in with your admin. And if not, EBS services would be the most helpful for that. And we share that contact information all the time. So I think Peter can share that in the chat if needed. Okay, and then the next point here is just define responsibility of defective merchandise with your 3PLs. So if you're working with third-party logistics, helping reach a congruence of where, how returns is going to be handled and whose responsibility it is for issues like pallet load or concealed shortages, or who gets the responsibility for certain issues that can result in deductions, but also those deduction return fines. And then another thing to call out is if you're looking at the actual cost of the return fine is Walmart will typically deduct the retail price of the item, not the cost to cover their lost revenue. So if the number looks off in terms of it should be, your COGS or a different number, it's actually going to be the retail price, which makes these fines even ickier, that they're just, that full price of the item, because you're losing out and also that retailer, Walmart, is losing out. And then we talk about the packaging standards pretty much every webinar, it feels like, but accessing that Walmart supplier standards for packaging will really help you with any SQEP fines, but also help you and your teams when it comes to protecting merchandise from damage. And if you're doing all of those things and you're still seeing damages, maybe that's a conversation with your 3PLs as well. So again, this kind of all overlaps, as you can see. Okay, and I kind of mentioned this a bit earlier in terms of renegotiating your OSA, but some of the questions you may want to be asking your teams is, when can you make addendums to your supplier agreement? And who do you do this with? What is the specification for all your businesses? Do you have your SAMS documents lined out? Do you have Walmart International, e-com, your Walmart brick and mortar? Are all of these aligned on the same return system? Is it different? Do you need to make changes there? What's working in one business and what's working in not? Kind of doing a comparison analysis there. Another question to ask is, does your category, your method of shipping, anything in your supply chain create specific or chronic problems specifically with returns? Maybe it's other deductions as well, but in this conversation, is it your 3PL that you're working with where you're constantly seeing returns? Is it your category that maybe it's the way that you're packaging things, or maybe it's even back to a consumer insights situation? Is your item set up correctly? And is it conveying the wrong information online? So someone who comes in store picks it up and then returns it later. All of these things kind of start to create more questions as you dive deeper into them. And then the last one here is, on your OSA, should you add a defective allowance to better plan for your cash flow? Is that something that would be helpful, or is the way that you're handling returns on your team now the better situation, and just kind of taking them as they come? You don't receive a lot of returns. Maybe that's the case. So playing with these questions can be helpful, and we'll send these to you when it comes to thinking about returns specific to your OSA. All right, now let's get into disputing returns. This is the question that everyone want to get into, how you dispute the specific returns on each code. All right, so to start here with this conversation, if you've been disputing, or maybe you haven't, maybe you're coming off settlement and you've usually just been doing the settlement process for returns, but you're no longer doing that, you're going to have 3 avenues for disputing, and it kind of depends on where that dispute is coming from. So if you get a code in APDP, or you see something come through on APIS, then I would start by checking if that code is disputable in APDP, and that's in Retail Link, and we've got other resources on APDP, the Accounts Payable Dispute Portal, if you need a little bit more information on that. And a call out here is, remember to dispute the return claims on one PO as a group, and then also looking for those different codes that kind of match together. So that's going to be your code 44 for your code 44, and then your code 97 or 60 for freight and handling, and then your main claim, which is going to outline why the actual return is happening. If you see a code, though, that says it's from location 9462, it's a return center claim. And the return center process, we're going to outline that here in a second. It's a little bit more manual than using APDP, but what's nice about the return center is they have their specific process for why you would get a return center claim, like a code 120. So that process is a little bit more cut and dry, and that team specifically works on returns. So there can be a little bit more understanding for return issues and deductions. But again, it would have to be from Walmart location 9462 to dispute the return center. And if someone's seen something different, please let us know in the chat if you disputed through the return system. But really what I have seen, and when I've talked with other suppliers, you have to be through Walmart location 9462. And then lastly, this is always an option, but again, we like to kind of say your mileage may vary depending on your buyer and the relationship you have. If you've been rejected through APDP or unable to dispute, and your claim is not from the return center, you can escalate this claim to your buyer. So you can dispute up to, I believe, 13 months back, or that's OTIF rather. You can dispute 2 years back for AP deductions. So, and you also have about 3 tries to dispute it, is kind of what we've seen with suppliers. So go ahead and dispute those first. And then, if you're disputing through the return center, working with your buyer, unless it's a specific question that they would know, is probably not as helpful. They don't really work with returns often. So if you can't do those first 2 things, talk to your buyer, escalate this claim to them, especially if it's a larger claim, it's invalid. And again, make this process as easy, simple, and clear for your buyer as possible, because they just have a lot of things going on, and I can bet returns are not at the top of their mind. So really button that up and make sure you go through every other step before working with your buyer, just to make it easier for them and make it easier for you. All right, so here's the return center dispute process. And it is not an actual application, but you do have to kind of gather the proof documentation and ship it off to the return center. So first you'll download and review the backup details, any documentation, and you can get a lot of that from APIS. And you can also pull some different reports. And if there's anything else attached to that, you would put it into the defective merchandise handling fee and RTV freight claim form. It's such a long name. You'll fill that out, that defective merchandise handling fee and RTV freight claim form, with the claim number, invoice date, amount you're disputing, and the reason for the dispute. So you can see with this, it kind of bulks all of the charges together. So it gives you that defective merchandise claim, the handling fee, and the RTV claim. So you can see that that's already bucketed together, which is nice. And then provide as much information as you can in terms of proof documentation if there's something else to attach. Another detail I would want to call out here is the amount you're disputing. Usually we would recommend disputing the full amount. And that's just because if you can get that amount of money back, great. But, you can only receive what you ask for. So go ahead and ask for that full amount. And maybe you only get partial back, but that's one call out: dispute for the full claim. And then the reason for the dispute. And the call out here is to use as much language as possible that is similar to what we've outlined. So if you can outline, this is a code 94 because of XYZ, that will be helpful for your dispute reasons. And then again, adding any proof documentation that you can to that for each claim. Then you'll submit that by creating a case with partner support. And I haven't really spent a ton of time in that part of Retail Link. So if any suppliers online have information about partner support, let me know. You'll select returns, return chargebacks, defective merchandising, handling, RTV, freight expense claims, and you must include the documentation and forms mentioned above for your claims to be reviewed. Another call out here, I have not spent a ton of time talking with suppliers about the return center. So if you do have a timeline for dispute to approved or dispute to, resolution reached, let us know. I'm more familiar, and our team is a little bit more familiar with APDP and the resolution timelines there. So I'm not sure how fast or slow the return center is. So I'd love to hear from you all. All right, and then here's some more contact information in terms of the return center. So for Walmart.com, and this is for .com, any Walmart.com returns are going to actually flow through that return center, and you can email with any questions. And you can also, it looks like, dispute any Walmart codes through here. But again, we always recommend using the process that's allowed. If you're not hearing back from Walmart, go ahead and use these claims for .com codes. And then we also have the Sam's Club return outlined here. And those claim numbers are going to look a little bit different than Walmart's. And then if you have any questions, also, we've included this email here. So we'll get you guys this deck in a couple of days, but you can also take a screenshot of this real quick. All right, now let's get into disputing the specific codes. And each one of these slides is going to say, check your OSA, because that's really the place you can start for your validity check. So once you've checked your OSA, the question you would ask for a code 44 is, does your agreement allow for returns to be shipped back to the supplier? If yes, if your agreement does allow for returns to be shipped back to the supplier, you can still dispute this as invalid if the handling charges are invalid. And the handling charges would be invalid if the main deduction code is invalid. So you kind of have to skip from here to the next step and say, okay, what is the actual main attraction code? Either that code 91, 92, 93, 94, or 95, is that invalid? But let's say that your supplier agreement does not allow for returns to be shipped back to the supplier. You would provide the supplier agreement showing that the merchandise should not be shipped back, and that code should be invalid. All right, and then disputing codes 60 and 97, like I said, 60 and 97 are very similar. They are based on the handling fees. So you check your OSA and you ask the question, does your agreement specify handling fees not to be charged? If yes, this code is invalid, and it's invalid regardless of the charge that it's anchoring on, but you still want to go after that main code, those code 91s through 95s. If no, you can still claim the return is invalid if the anchoring return or main attraction return deduction is invalid. So with these, code 44, code 60, code 97, look at these and, you want to know if it's invalid, but go after that code that it is anchored to first. All right, I'm just checking my time, make sure we're doing good here. Sweet. So with disputing code 91, check your OSA, and you want to see and ask yourself, does your agreement outline the supplier's consent for damaged merchandise to be returned and not destroyed or not considered defective? So if yes, that's correct, you can still claim that the return is invalid. If the handling charges were invalid, you can still win back those claims. You might not necessarily win back this code 91, but go ahead and dispute it since it's attached to that, that main code. And then if no, provide the supplier agreement showing that the merchandise should not be returned to the supplier, and that should be canceled. Then disputing codes 93, 94, and 92 are pretty similar. So I've kind of outlined here the different ways you can look at disputing if these are invalid, because there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. So again, these are going to be disputed with your code 44, 60, 75, 120, and you'll check your OSA for these 4 areas for these main codes. So with the first bucket, you can look at defect allowance, your defect allowance. Look at your OSA and see if the documentation shows the total cost of the defect returns to the date versus the amount paid in the defective allowance. Really, that's just saying, have you hit your defective allowance? If not, you should be able to claim, no, I should have had my defect attached to this, my defect allowance attached to this, and it would be sent to that rather than something that you would be deducted for. The second bucket is responsibility. Look at the supplier agreement showing that defective returns are not the responsibility of the supplier. So seeing, the details of, no, you shouldn't have sent those back to me. Those should be destroyed, or for some other reason, like your 3PLs, or if you can prove for some reason that Walmart is actually responsible for this claim. A third one is failure to return. So check your supplier agreement to see if you are supposed to receive those, that merchandise back. And if not, if the goods were never received, then you can dispute that those were never returned to you, therefore not adhering to your supplier agreement. And then that last one is pricing. So attaching pricing info showing the actual cost of the item as less than the cost deducted per item on claim. So these are some of the ways that you can dispute these codes. And then code 95, you check this code specifically on failure to return. And we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to breeze past this one. But essentially, the supplier agreement should show that the defective goods must be returned, and if they were never received. And then these are some of the reasons that they might not ship back that are valid, such as hazardous materials, broken glass, and then also virtual claims. So we'll kind of skip over this just for now because I want to make sure we have time for questions. And then disputing code 120, the two areas are pricing discrepancy, which we kind of talked about when looking at codes 92, 93, and 94, and then defect allowance. And that's just going back to knowing if your defect allowance is being attached to this type of return. And if not, you can claim that as invalid. All right. And then we've kind of talked through the proof documentation, but it's really, your OSA outlining either your defect allowance, your handling fees, destination, the returns process that's outlined, and then pricing info. Okay, Peter, I think I'm ready for some questions, and we can go over just a tiny bit if we don't have enough time to get to some of these.
Sure, yeah. We've got 4. One of them we can start off with, which we've already kind of addressed. Chris is asking, do you ever see them double or triple dipping on different return codes for the same item? For example, a code 94 and then a code 91 for the same product.
A code 94 and then a code 91. I'm going to say no. What Walmart is usually pretty good, and I say usually just because, we want to not use absolutes here. They're usually pretty good about in the insular compliance or deduction space. So whether it's your AP deductions or compliance or SQEP, they're usually pretty good about not double charging you for a certain type of deduction. So return deduction, you might not see those together, but you might see a shortage deduction with return deduction, and that's kind of within the AP deduction space. Or you might see a SQEP compliance charge with a deduction charge. So usually like with OTIF is a great example where they usually keep it pretty either or. You'll either get an on-time fine or you get an in full fine. But because there are so many different buckets of AP deduction codes, you will see a little bit of overlap because they do consider those different situations, even though there is a lot of that overlap, but you won't necessarily see two return deductions on one PO.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Another one from Chris as well. Can you please address the new defective chargebacks, quote, marked down to $0, announced last April? This is something I'd never heard of before. So, And I've been asking some people on Slack to see if anyone else knows, and I haven't heard anything back yet. So can you please address the new defective chargebacks for markdown to $0 announced last April? We were blindsided by huge charges for this bucket that we hadn't planned for. Have you had any success disputing these charges? Thank you.
I will say that I would have to look at first what compliance program that it is attached to. I think it's saying that it's attached to deductions. It doesn't sound like it's a compliance issue. And then I would say also what code is it being attributed to? So if it's it also kind of sounds like it's trade promotions or allowance situation, a markdown dollar. So I would say I don't have that information readily available in terms of the allowance, but my first question is, where are you seeing this defective charge? If it's AP, look at the reason codes. We have an outline of the reason codes book. And to me, it's sounding like a allowance fine in the AP deduction space, but I don't necessarily know unless it is attached to a return, but I haven't heard of that attached to a return type of deduction. So
yeah, based on my kind of surface level looking around, I was guessing it would be a code 66. So I think the 60s are allowances. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so. Don't quiz me on it right now. I'm thinking about returns.
So that's what I was guessing, but again, not totally sure. So maybe going to that deductions codes landing page and looking for 66 or somewhere in the 60s and try to kind of associate with one of those and disputing it that way would be our best guess. Sarah wants to know, can you touch on virtual returns?
Yes, we pulled a little bit of that in. Oops, went ahead. We can go back to the virtual returns. So by virtual returns, I think you mean the returncenter.com information. And that would just be similar to return center dispute process. And that's how you would fill that out. It's just downloading that information, attaching the proof documentation, and then sending that off. So I think that's what you mean by virtual claims. I did want to answer one question we got ahead of time in terms of running reports on return processes. And I wanted to call this out because you can run a report on DSS, decision support. And you can actually click into returns data and just pull all those columns within the store detail template. But we have, what I want to say here is take that with a grain of salt, because that is up to store associates to key in those return reasons. So if you are pulling that information in DSS, I'd love to know if you feel like that is valuable information. But from what we've talked to other suppliers from, is that's not necessarily going to be the most helpful. But again, up to you.
Okay, we had one guest attempt to kind of answer Chris's question, saying they've seen those in years past when there are mod changes and items are deleted off mod or reduced traded store counts. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that's kind of helpful or relevant, but it might be.
So it couldn't end up, if it's from that, it could definitely end up as a overstock and returned that way. So that's an interesting overlap, because sometimes the system isn't fully clear on how you do that overlap. All right, you guys know about Supplier Wiki resources, so I'm going to skip this for now. And I'm just going to throw up our contact information. If you have any more questions or you want to take a look at Supplier Wiki or SupplyPike, you can do that. And I'm going to click into the demo now, and we'll get that started. If this is where you have to log off, we totally understand. We hope that you join us for another webinar. But as I pull up this demo, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Peter, just give me some confirmation that you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see you.
Great. All right, let's get into a preview of Deductions Navigator. We're calling this a preview because really in 5 minutes, you can't sum up the full functionality of the product, but we've talked a lot about some of the pain points with disputing with Walmart. So we're going to look at the Deductions Navigator for Walmart. And a call out here is Deductions Navigator has different levels of automation for Walmart, Target, Amazon, and Kroger deductions. So you can easily toggle between your different retail businesses. And then this is kind of built into two different parts. We're going to land here on the dashboard for a second. And this is really helpful for that impactful information. You don't have to pull any manual spreadsheets. It pulls everything in, and you can get those health metrics really quickly and have those high-level conversations about where your deductions are sitting and how you can improve them. So it's helpful to just kind of see the full number that you can dispute with SupplyPike, and then the dollar amount that you have won back through SupplyPike. Another call out here, if you haven't sat on one of our previews of the Deduction Navigator application before, a lot of other softwares that do a similar process to us, or brokerages who kind of go in and handle disputes for you, they will charge by a percentage of the amount that you dispute with them. SupplyPike, we do things a little bit differently. It's a flat monthly subscription. So you could dispute $10, or you could just dispute, $1 million, and it's going to be based off of that monthly subscription. So that's really nice that you can dispute as much as you want. And then you can see also kind of a health metric here is the deduction percentage of invoices. And this is a demo account, so it's actually a pretty low number. The average for the industry is about 6%. So you can kind of just see a really quick snapshot of the health of your deductions at your particular supplier company. And then this information is really helpful just to kind of see what's still left on the table. So you've got the deductions you've received, what is actionable, that money left on the table, what's awaiting repayment, the total that's been paid back to you as the supplier, and then you can see your dispute win rate. And then another call out here, you can see this is just our demo account, so it's based on it's not actually pulling data into it, but if this is a real account, it would be updated every day, if not more. So, and then you can also just see a couple more deductions, pullouts. So you've got your deduction by status. You can see what's disputed, what's in Walmart research. So it has the different terms that are aligned to APDP. You've got your supplier action, what suppliers still need to go back and hit, what's approved, what's paid, denied, canceled, settled, and will not dispute. And then this one will probably go away here in a second since settlement is ending. But you can also see the count and dollar amount each claim is hitting you with. So, you can see if 22s, merchandise billed not shipped, if that's an issue that's really hitting your business, maybe you see a return issue up here, a return code, and you know that those are the ones you want to go after. And this is another easy way to slice and dice, is just seeing the deduction amount. You can toggle between amount and count. So you can see, maybe you have a bigger bucket here, but you really want to go after the count that's driving up here in that deduction range. Deductions over time compared to amount and count across years. Then claim lines by item number and deductions by location. So maybe you see a lot of the same DC hitting with deductions and knowing how to tackle that. So that's really the impactful information side. Whereas this is the actionable side. This is where it's really tactical, because SupplyPike is able to help you know how to process between what you can go after today, what's already been worked on, what's archived, and then you can see all deductions. You can filter between that. If you sit on actionable, you can really just be ready to dispute from the app and do that really quickly. We see that the average time to dispute is 20 minutes per dispute. So with this, really, you would just have to filter from validity. You don't have to do any of that determination on the back end. So if you know that it's going to be invalid, and you want to have all the proof documentation attached, you don't want to do any work, you want to make this one the easiest claim that you've disputed, you can go in, look at all the information, enter a couple different details in terms of dispute reason, load number, but all of this information is already pulled in for you, all of your proof documentation. The business logic is built in that tells you, actually, we think this one is invalid. And then you'd get a notification here that says ready to dispute, and you could hit dispute and be done with it. Another really cool thing about deductions is that didn't take a lot of time, but you can dispute in bulk. So you can dispute a huge chunk of deductions all in one go based on the different filters you want to put on, whether that's going after similar codes, claim lines. But yeah, this is basically the application. You can use this again, like I said, for Walmart, Amazon, Target, and Kroger. And if you're interested, please go ahead and sign up for a demo at SupplyPike.com. We have a free trial. It lasts about 1 to 2 weeks. And then you're actually able to pull in your information and start disputing with your data. So it's really helpful, we think. And hopefully this was a great presentation on returns, and then you guys got something from the preview as well. So with that, I'm going to say bye, and hope everyone has a great